the-Wisps. In the rural landscapes of Vietnam, there are places that villagers avoid after dark: swamps, rice paddies, and narrow, winding roads that cut through dense forests. It is in these places where mysterious, glowing orbs known as the-Wisps are said to appear. The locals believe that these ghostly lights are restless spirits, wandering the earth because their bodies were never properly buried or their deaths were sudden and violent. Legends say that if a traveler encounters the Ma-Tri, they must never follow the lights. The spirits are mischievous and malevolent, leading people astray into dangerous terrain where they may never return. Nguyen Quang, a young and skeptical journalist from Hanoi, had always been fascinated by ghost stories, though he didn't believe in them. He often traveled to remote villages to collect local folklore and write about superstitions in his column. When he heard about the Ma-Tri from an elderly man in a small village nestled in the Central Highlands, his curiosity was piqued. The old man's stories of travelers vanishing after chasing strange lights made for a perfect spooky feature. Despite the elder's warnings, Quang decided to investigate for himself. Equipped with his notebook, camera, and flashlight, Quang set out one evening to explore the infamous marshland where the mysterious lights were said to appear. He was determined to capture the phenomenon on film and debunk the myth once and for all. As night fell, he made his way through the thick mist that clung to the marshes like a ghostly shroud. The only sounds were the croaking of frogs and the occasional rustle of the wind through the tall grass. Quang, though alert, felt a sense of excitement. To him, this was just another opportunity to show that such superstitions were nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. Little did he know, this night would change his perspective forever. The deeper Quang ventured into the marshland, the more isolated he felt. The moonlight was faint, barely cutting through the fog that seemed to grow thicker with each step. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the wet ground. Occasionally, he stopped to take photos of the surroundings, hoping to capture something unusual. But so far, everything seemed quiet. As he walked further into the marshes, Quang noticed something in the distance, a faint, bluish glow hovering just above the surface of the water. His heart skipped a beat. It was exactly what the old man had described. The light flickered softly, like a candle in the wind, moving gently from side to side. A thrill of excitement surged through him. This was the proof he had been looking for, the mysterious Ma-Tri. But rather than feeling afraid, Quang was determined to get closer. He wanted a better look, and more importantly, he wanted to capture it on camera. Without hesitation, he switched on his camera and started taking photos as he moved toward the light. The closer he got, the more the light seemed to dance in front of him, always just out of reach. It was as if the orb was leading him somewhere, drawing him deeper into the marsh. Quang, entranced by the sight, followed without thinking twice. The glow was mesmerizing, and for a moment, he forgot everything the old man had warned him about. The terrain beneath his feet became more treacherous, the ground softening into thick, muddy patches. His shoes squelched with every step, but he pressed on, determined not to lose sight of the light. The fog swirled around him, making it harder to see, but the blue glow remained steady like a beacon in the darkness. Suddenly, the light split into several smaller orbs, each one darting in different directions, circling him playfully. Quang stopped, momentarily confused. His rational mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. Could these really be the spirits the villagers feared? His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat began to form on his brow. The orbs danced closer, their glow casting long shadows across the marsh. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. Quang stood frozen in place, staring at the spot where the lights had been. The fog seemed thicker now, and the night felt unnaturally quiet. A deep sense of unease settled over him, and for the first time, he felt truly alone. He looked around, trying to orient himself, but the path he had taken was no longer visible. The marsh stretched out in every direction, and nothing looked familiar. A low whisper carried on the wind, just barely audible over the stillness. Kwang's breath caught in his throat. It was as if the marsh itself had come alive, whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization set in he was lost. Kwang tried to remain calm. His logical mind told him that the fog was playing tricks on him, that he could easily find his way back if he retraced his steps. He took out his phone to check the time and GPS, but to his frustration, the screen flickered, then went black. The battery, which had been fully charged earlier, was now dead. Cursing under his breath, Kwang turned back to the direction he thought he had come from, but the more he walked, the more disoriented he became. Every direction looked the same, endless stretches of marshland, fog so thick it felt like a living thing pressing against him. His flashlight was growing dimmer, and soon it too flickered out, plunging him into near total darkness. Just then, the faint glow of the blue lights reappeared in the distance. This time, there were more of them, hovering just beyond reach, as if waiting for him. Kwang's initial excitement was now replaced by dread. The lights seemed to be mocking him, toying with his sense of direction. He could still hear the old man's warning in his head, "Never follow the mantra. They will lead you to your death." But what choice did he have? With no other way to navigate through the thick fog, Kwang reluctantly moved toward the lights, hoping they would guide him out of the marsh. As he followed, the orbs moved faster, darting away only to reappear further ahead. His steps quickened, a sense of urgency rising in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. His breaths came in short gasps, and the marsh seemed to grow colder with each passing moment. Without warning, the ground beneath him gave way, and Kwang stumbled into a deep patch of mud. He struggled to free himself, but the more he moved, the deeper he sank. Panic surged through him as he realized he was caught in quicksand. The lights danced around him, flickering just out of reach, but offered no help. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. But the marsh swallowed his cries, and the fog seemed to close in tighter around him. As the mud reached his knees, Kwang's mind raced. He had to stay calm, had to find a way out. Using all his strength, he tried to pull his legs free, inching backward toward firmer ground. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to drag himself out of the quicksand, panting and covered in mud. The lights were gone again, leaving him in pitch darkness. He sat there for a moment, gasping for air, shaken by how close he had come to losing his life. But his relief was short-lived. In the distance, a faint rustling sound reached his ears. Something was moving in the fog, and it was getting closer. Kwang's heart raced as the rustling grew louder, the sound of wet footsteps welching through the marsh. He stood up, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Whatever was approaching wasn't natural. He could feel it in his bones, the oppressive weight of something dark and malevolent drawing nearer. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the blue lights again. But this time, they weren't playful or distant. They floated closer, swirling around him in tight circles. The whispers in the wind returned louder now, as if a chorus of voices was speaking all at once. Then, through the fog, Kwang saw then the figures of people, pale and transparent, emerging from the marsh. Their faces were blank, expressionless, their eyes hollow and glowing faintly with the same blue light as the orbs. They moved slowly but deliberately, their heads turning in unison to face him. Kwang's legs felt like they were made of lead. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't move. The figures closed in, surrounding him on all sides. Their voices became clearer now, overlapping in a haunting cacophony. "You should not have come here," they whispered, their voices merging into one. "This is our place, our resting place." Kwang felt a cold hand grip his wrist. He looked down, and to his horror, saw that one of the ghostly figures had latched onto him, its icy touch sending a jolt of terror through his body. "Let go," he screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened. The other figures began to reach for him, their hands stretching out, ready to drag him into the marsh. Kwong struggled, but it was no use. He was surrounded, trapped by the spirits of those who had died here long ago. Just when he thought all hope was lost, the faint sound of a bell rang through the fog, a clear, sharp chime that cut through the oppressive silence. The figures recoiled at the sound, their hands retreating as they backed away into the shadows. The blue lights flickered once more and disappeared entirely, leaving Kwong alone in the darkness. The bell rang again, closer now, and a figure emerged from the mist. It was the old man from the village, carrying a small lantern and a wooden bell in his hand. "Come with me," the old man said, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to leave before they return." Kwong, too shaken to speak, nodded and followed the old man as they made their way back through the marsh. The fog gradually lifted, and soon they reached the edge of the village. "You were lucky," the old man said, his eyes grin. "The Ma Tri usually don't let people go once they've been lured in." Kwong shuddered, knowing how close he had come to becoming one of the lost souls in the marsh. He thanked the old man and left the village the next morning, vowing never to chase after ghost stories again.